School is the strangest invention we have. We put 30 children of identical age in a room, ring a bell every 45 minutes, and ask them to prove what they know by writing alone in silence. Nobody designed this for the world we currently live in. It was designed for a world of factories, filing cabinets, and scarce information, and it worked brilliantly for that world. Then the world changed 3 times over while the classroom stayed almost exactly the same. The human curriculum is a 5-episode journey through the long, surprising, deeply human story of how we learn to teach, from Sumerian scribes to Prussian bureaucrats to the standardized test, and then straight into the storm we are standing in right now, the attention economy, the collapse of the take-home essay, and the arrival of machines that can write, tutor, argue, and hallucinate. This is not a series about panic, and it is not a series about hype. It is a series about people. The 14-year-old staring at a blinking cursor, the teacher grading at 11 at night, the parent who does not know whether to be proud or terrified. We will hear every side of the argument fairly. The abolitionists who want AI out of schools entirely. The accelerationists who think the classroom is already obsolete. And the exhausted majority in the middle who just want to know what to do on Monday. And then we will get practical. Most of the series is spent on what to actually do. Classroom protocols you can use next week. Assessment redesigns that survive contact with the chatbot. Curriculum surgery, teacher training that respects teachers, and the policy choices governments are quietly getting wrong. We will call many of these experiments on purpose because nobody on earth knows the right answer yet. And anyone who tells you otherwise is definitely selling you something. So, 5 episodes, 1 question underneath all of them. When a machine can produce the answer, what exactly is a human education for? Now, before we start, let me share the series outline with you. Let me start with episode 1, which we're going to have today, The Factory That Taught Us to Sit Still. We're going to talk about the deep history of education from oral cultures and apprenticeship through the scribal schools, monastic and madrasa traditions, the printing press, the Prussian model, the Industrial Revolution, mass compulsory schooling, the standardization movement, and the 20th century's failed and partial reforms. And this episode ends by establishing the central puzzle. The world reorganized itself several times, and the classroom did not. In our episode 2, we're going to talk about the attention wars. What happened to learning between roughly 2007 and 2022? Smartphones, social platforms, the economics of attention, adolescent mental health, the loss of boredom and deep reading, the pandemic's forced experiment in remote learning, and the arrival of generative AI into a system that was already destabilized. In this episode, we'll frame AI as an accelerant on an existing fire, not the origin of it. In our episode 3, everyone in this argument is partly right. We're going to have a fair steelman tour of the whole spectrum. Prohibitionists, cautious integrationists, pragmatists, enthusiasts, and abolitionists who think schooling itself is the obsolete part. We will cover cognitive offloading, the desirable difficulty research, equity arguments on both sides, detection and false accusation, labor concerns for teachers, and what we actually know versus what we are guessing. In episode 4, What to Do on Monday, we're going to talk about the practical core for teachers and students. Assessment redesign, the shift from product to process, in-class writing, oral defense, the AI as adversary and AI as tutor patterns, prompting as a teachable skill, feedback loops, cognitive apprenticeship, protocols for disclosure, and a set of concrete classroom experiments with success criteria. And in episode 5, the final episode of the series, Rebuilding the Curriculum, the School, and the Rules, we're going to talk about the institutional and civic layer. What content should be cut, kept, and added, assessment and credentialing reform, teacher preparation and workload, procurement, data privacy and vendor pressure, government policy, equity, and infrastructure. We're going to talk about a 90-day plan, a 2-year arc, and a closing argument about what a human education is for when the answers are free. This is going to be our series, and this is a new series brought to you by English Plus with Danny podcast. And now let's start with the first episode, The Factory That Taught Us to Sit Still. Let's start with something that might annoy you. Now, think back to a classroom, any year. You are sitting in a row. There is a clock on the wall. Somewhere around the middle of the morning, your attention slides off the lesson like water off glass, and you find yourself staring out of a window at absolutely nothing. And then a bell rings, and you get up and walk to a different room to do the same thing about a different subject. Now, here's the annoying part. Almost every element of that memory was a design decision. Someone chose it. The rows, the bell, the 45 minutes, the fact that you were in a room with people born in the same 12-month window as you, the fact that knowledge arrived chopped into subjects that never spoke to each other. None of it fell out of the sky. None of it is how humans naturally learn. Every piece of it was engineered, mostly by people who died a long time ago to solve problems that, in many cases, no longer exist. And here's the question I want to hang over this entire series. If the whole thing was designed, then it can be redesigned. So why hasn't it been? Now, we're going to spend 5 episodes on artificial intelligence and education. But I refuse to start there, because starting there is how people end up making very confident, very stupid predictions. You cannot understand what a technology will do to a system until you understand what the system is for, who built it, and what it was optimized to produce. So today, we will go backwards, all the way backwards. And I promise you, it is more interesting than it sounds. Because the history of education is basically the history of humanity arguing with itself about what a person is supposed to become. So start before schools. For the overwhelming majority of human existence, there were no schools. And yet learning happened constantly and rather well. Children learned by proximity. You watched, you imitated, you failed in low-stakes conditions, you were corrected by someone who loved you or at least needed you to be competent. Anthropologists who study the remaining foraging societies describe something that would horrify a modern school inspector. Children playing in mixed-age groups, largely unsupervised, absorbing the entire skill set of their culture without a single lesson plan. Knowledge was embedded in life. It was not a separate activity you went somewhere to receive. The system had one enormous advantage. Everything you learned was obviously connected to something real. Nobody ever had to ask when they were going to use this. And it had one fatal limitation. It could only transmit what the group already knew. It could not accumulate. Then came writing, and everything cracked open. Around 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, humans invented a way to store thought outside of a human head. And almost immediately, they invented the school. The Sumerians called it the Eduba, the tablet house. And we have the homework. Actual clay tablets from 4,000 years ago covered in the wobbly practice strokes of children learning cuneiform. We also have something even better. We have their complaints. There is a Sumerian text where a student describes being canned for standing up without permission, for talking, for sloppy handwriting. There's another where a father lectures his son about wasting his education and hanging around in the street. 4,000 years, and the genre has not changed. Whatever else you take from this episode, take this. The parent-child conversation about not applying yourself is older than the pyramids. Now, notice what happened there, though. The moment knowledge could be stored outside the body, learning got separated from living. You now had to go to a special building, sit with a specialist, and acquire something abstract that would only pay off much later. The trade off, abstraction and accumulation in exchange for relevance and immediacy, is the founding bargain of formal education. And every complaint about school ever since is essentially a complaint about the terms of that bargain. And now let's take a detour because this one is going to come back and haunt us in episode 3. In Athens, Socrates spent his life doing something we now consider the gold standard of teaching: asking relentless questions, refusing to hand over conclusions, dragging understanding out of people rather than pouring in it. And Socrates was deeply suspicious of a new technology sweeping through his culture. That technology was writing. His argument, as Plato records it, was that writing would create forgetfulness in the souls of those who learned it, because they would stop exercising memory and start relying on external marks. He said written words seem to speak intelligently, but if you question them, they just repeat the same thing over and over. They cannot answer you. They give the appearance of wisdom without the reality. Now think about that for a second. The most celebrated teacher in Western history looked at the most important educational technology in human history and said it would make people shallow, dependent, and only apparently wise. He was wrong about the outcome. He was not wrong about the mechanism. Writing genuinely did degrade human memory capacity. Oral cultures could hold epics in their heads that would break us. And it genuinely did produce people who could sound knowledgeable by quoting things they had not thought through. Socrates identified a real cost. He simply could not see the vastly larger benefit, because the benefit arrived in a form he could not imagine. Libraries, science, the accumulation of thought across centuries. I want you to file that away. We will need it. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, China was inventing the thing that would eventually take over every education system on Earth: the exam. The imperial examination system, refined over roughly 13 centuries, was in principle magnificent. Government positions awarded not by birth, but by demonstrated learning. A farmer's son could, in theory, rise to the highest offices by mastering the classics. It was one of the earliest large-scale attempts at meritocracy, and it made Chinese administration the envy of the world. It also produced every pathology of high-stakes testing that we live with today, several hundred years early. Cram schools, candidates memorizing text wholesale without comprehension, cheat sheets written on silk undershirts in characters so small they needed magnification, men taking the exam into their 60s, their entire identity absorbed by a single test. A curriculum frozen for centuries because changing the test was politically impossible. When you hear educators complain about teaching to the test, understand that this is not a modern degradation. It is an ancient structural consequence of using a single measurement to allocate life outcomes. Any test that determines a person's future stops measuring learning and starts generating a whole industry devoted to defeating it. Now, through the same centuries, the Islamic world built the madrasa system and something I find quietly beautiful: the ijazah. In that tradition, the license to teach a text was not granted by an institution. It was granted by a specific teacher to a specific student, certifying that this person had studied this work with them and could now transmit it. Your qualification was a chain of human relationships going back to the author. Education as lineage. Compare that to a modern transcript, which certifies that you were in a room for a certain number of hours and produced acceptable marks, and tell me which one sounds more like it is measuring understanding. Then Europe and the medieval university, Bologna, Paris, Oxford. The word university comes from universitas, meaning a guild or corporation. These were essentially trade unions of scholars and students, organized to negotiate with towns and popes. And here's the detail I love because it explains something you have sat through hundreds of times. The core teaching method was the lecture. The Latin word lectio means literally a reading. The professor read the book aloud and the students wrote it down. Why? Because books were handmade, astronomically expensive, and there was only one copy. The lecture was not a pedagogical theory. It was a file transfer protocol. It was the fastest available method of copying a text from one place into 30 places using the only technology available, which was a voice and a lot of hands. The printing press arrived in the 1450s and destroyed the reason for the lecture within a generation. The lecture is still here. It has outlived its own justification by roughly 570 years. I want you to remember that the next time someone tells you educational practices change because they stop working. They do not. They persist long after their purpose has evaporated because institutions are made of habits. And habits are load-bearing. Now, the press did change something enormous, though. Once books were cheap, the idea that ordinary people should read became thinkable, and then it became urgent because the Protestant Reformation insisted that individuals should read scripture themselves. Literacy stopped being a specialist skill and became a moral obligation. That is the ideological seed of universal education. And it is worth noticing that it was planted by religion, not by economics. Now, the first person to think seriously about how to do this at scale was a Czech named John Amos Comenius in the 1600s. He is the closest thing education has to a founding architect, and he is barely known outside the field. He argued for teaching everyone, including girls, including the poor, in their own language rather than Latin. He wrote what is essentially the first illustrated children's textbook. And he proposed organizing students into classes by age, moving them through a graded sequence with a trained teacher and a standard book. He was trying to be humane. He was reacting against schools that he described as slaughterhouses of the mind. But that structure, invented out of kindness and a desire for order, is the skeleton of the thing you sat inside for 13 years. And now Prussia, where the skeleton gets its muscles. In the 1700s, and especially after Prussia's humiliating defeat by Napoleon in 1806, the Prussian state built the world's first comprehensive national system of compulsory schooling. Free or cheap, universal, state-funded, age-graded classrooms, a national curriculum, teacher training colleges and teacher certification, standardized examination, compulsory attendance enforced by law. It was, by the standards of the era, extraordinarily progressive, and much of it we should be grateful for. But we should be honest about the design brief. The Prussian state was not primarily trying to produce free-thinking individuals. It was trying to produce loyal subjects, competent soldiers, reliable bureaucrats, and a unified national identity, all at scale, all measurable. Punctuality, obedience to a schedule, response to a signal, deference to authority, and the ability to perform a specified task correctly on demand were not accidental byproducts of the system. They were the specification. And it worked so well that everyone copied it. Horsemen traveled to Prussia in the 1840s, came back to Massachusetts evangelizing, and the American Common School movement took the template. Japan took it during the Meiji era. France, and through France and Britain, the colonial world took it. which is why a classroom in Beirut, in Lagos, in Buenos Aires, and in Manila all have a suspiciously similar shape. Now, this is one of the most successful design exports in human history, and almost nobody knows they are living inside it. Then, the Industrial Revolution poured its logic into the mold, and the modern school hardened into place. Three things happened at once. First, factories needed workers who could read instructions, do arithmetic, show up at a precise time, work in coordinated shifts, and follow a foreman. Second, child labor laws, genuinely humane, genuinely necessary, well, those pulled millions of children out of mills and mines, which created an immediate and enormous problem. Where do you put all those children? And third, urbanization concentrated those children into cities where you could gather hundreds of them under one roof. So, we built a building where children are sorted into batches by manufacture date, moved through a sequence of standardized processes at a fixed pace, signaled by a bell borrowed directly from factory shift management, inspected at regular intervals for quality control, and stamped at the end with a certification of compliance. I am being unfair and also completely accurate. An influential American education administrator, Elwood Cubberley, wrote almost exactly this in 1916 approvingly. He described schools as factories in which the raw products are to be shaped into finished products according to specifications laid down by the demands of civilization. He was not being critical. He thought this was the good news. The efficiency movement finished the job. Frederick Taylor's scientific management, stopwatches, time and motion studies, one best way to perform every task, all these swept through American industry and then straight into school administration. And with it came measurement. In 1906, the Carnegie Foundation, trying to standardize what a high school credit meant, effectively established the Carnegie Unit. A certain number of hours of seat time in a subject equals 1 credit. Read that again. We chose to denominate education in units of time spent sitting in a room. Not in demonstrated competence, not in what you can do, in duration of physical presence. The currency is still in use nearly everywhere right now, today. Now, testing scaled next. Alfred Binet developed early intelligence assessments in France with the specific intention of identifying children who needed extra help. Within a decade, the tools has been carried elsewhere, rebranded as measurements of fixed innate ability and used to sort. During the First World War, the American Army tested nearly 2 million recruits, proving that mass standardized assessment was logistically possible. And in 1914, a man named Frederick Kelly invented something to cope with a wartime teacher shortage: the multiple choice question. Fast to administer, faster to grade, requires no expert judgment. Kelly himself later argued it was a lower order of thinking and should not dominate. Well, it dominated. It is still dominating. There is a lesson there about how a tool adopted for administrative convenience quietly becomes the definition of what counts as knowledge. By around 1925, the architecture is finished. Age cohorts, subject silos, time periods, seat time credits, standardized testing, ranked sorting, a teacher at the front, and a curriculum decided far above the classroom. And what I want you to notice is that from that point on, the story is not one of transformation. It is one of waves crashing against a very stable structure. The waves were real. John Dewey argued powerfully that education is not preparation for life, but life itself, and that children learn by doing, in community, through inquiry. Maria Montessori built an entire alternative with prepared environments and self-directed work. The progressive movement produced beautiful schools, but they remain a minority. Then Sputnik went up in 1957, and panic funded a decade of science and math curriculum reform. The 1970s brought open classrooms and knocked down some walls, then quietly rebuilt them. In 1983, an American report called A Nation at Risk declared the system was drowning in mediocrity and launched the standards and accountability era, which gave us more testing, not less. Then No Child Left Behind. Then the international league tables. Then a global arms race to comparative rankings that has made every education minister on earth nervous about the same three numbers. And technology promised deliverance roughly once per decade. Thomas Edison predicted that motion pictures would replace textbooks and revolutionize the schools. Educational radio was going to bring the best teachers to every child. Instructional television in the 1950s and 60s was going to solve the teacher shortage. B.F. Skinner built teaching machines that would deliver perfectly personalized reinforcement schedules. Then computers in the classroom. Then interactive whiteboards. Then one laptop per child. Then the MOOC wave around 2012, which was going to end the university within 5 years. Each one was going to democratize learning. Each one produced real but modest effects and left the fundamental architecture untouched. Two historians of education, David Tayek and Larry Cuban, gave this phenomenon a name that I think is the single most useful concept in the field: the grammar of schooling. Just as the grammar of a language is the deep structure you follow without noticing, the grammar of schooling is the set of assumptions so basic that reforms have to be phrased in its terms to even be understood. Students are grouped by age. Knowledge is divided into subjects. Time is divided into periods. Learning is certified by credits. One adult manages roughly 30 children in a room. Reforms that fit this grammar get observed. Reforms that violate it get rejected like a transplanted organ, no matter how good the evidence is. Now, there's a famous thought experiment about this, and it lands every time. Take a surgeon from 1900 and drop them into a modern operating theater. They would be paralyzed. They would not recognize the machines, the monitors, the imaging, the anesthesia, the sterile protocols, the drugs, or half the procedures. They could not participate. Now, take a teacher from 1900 and drop them into a typical classroom today. They would recognize almost everything: rows, board at the front, textbook, homework, tests, bell, subjects, ages. Give them a few minutes to figure out the screen, and they could teach the lesson. This is not a joke about teachers. Teachers are among the most inventive people I have ever met, and much of what happens inside those rows has improved enormously. Our understanding of how money works, how to give feedback, and how to support students with different needs, how to teach reading. The improvements are real, but they are improvements to the interior of a structure whose exterior was poured in concrete around 1920 for an economy that ran on coal and paperwork, in a world where information was scarce and expensive and had to be carried to you by a person. Now, here's where that leaves us. We built this system to solve a specific problem. Information was hard to get. Expertise was hard to reach. And industry needed millions of people with baseline literacy, numeracy, punctuality, and compliance. On its own terms, it was one of the greatest achievements of the modern world. Universal schooling lifted global literacy from a small minority to the overwhelming majority in about a century. Do not let anyone tell you the system failed. It succeeded spectacularly at the thing it was built to do. The problem is that the thing it was built to do is no longer scarce. Information is now free, instant, and infinite. Expertise is a search away. And as of the last few years, something even stranger has happened. The ability to produce a competent-looking piece of intellectual work, like an essay, an analysis, a solution, or an explanation, this has itself become abundant and nearly free. The entire system was designed around producing and evaluating exactly that. So when a machine can generate the architect we spent 150 years using as our primary evidence of learning, we do not have a cheating problem. We have a foundations problem. This is where we're going next. But before we get there, we have to understand what had already happened to attention, motivation, and the emotional lives of young people in the 15 years before anyone typed a prompt into a chatbot. Because AI did not arrive into a healthy system. It arrived into a system that was already shaking. That is what we're going to talk about in episode 2. Now, some things to chew on before then. First, which parts of your own education were about learning and which parts were about compliance? And be honest, because for most of us, the answer is uncomfortable and mixed. Second, if you had to justify one single feature of school design to a visiting alien, the age grouping, the periods, the grades, the exams, which one could you actually defend on evidence rather than habit? And third, and this is the one I would really like you to mull over, Socrates was wrong about writing and right about the mechanism. What does that suggest about how we should listen to today's warnings? And then I want you to do something, because listening is the passive version of thinking. I want you to pick one feature of schooling you have always assumed was natural and spend 20 minutes finding out where it came from. The summer holiday, the report card, the school bell, homework, the 90-minute exam. Every one of them has an origin story, and most of them will surprise you. If you teach, try this. Ask your students which parts of your class exist because they help learning and which exist because that is how school works. Their answers will be brutal and extremely useful. If you're a parent, ask your child what the most useless 45 minutes of their week is. And instead of correcting them, ask why. And if you are a student, find out what the Carnegie unit is. And then ask a teacher whether they think time in a seat is a good measure of what you know. Now watch their face while you ask them that. My friends, we inherited a machine. We did not choose it. And most of us never even looked at its blueprints. But now, the world it was built for has quietly disappeared. And something new is standing in the room asking to be let in. All right, that was the first episode of our series, The Human Curriculum, Education in the Age of AI. Don't forget that we still have 4 more episodes in this series, so you don't want to miss those. Thank you very much for listening. I'll see you again next time.